What's the similarity and what's the difference between reactive and creative? The difference is obvious when we are in our work, living out our missions. When we get in that reactive space, that has all that negative energy to it over against creative, where we can show up calm, focused, solution oriented. But what's the similarity? Well, when I was listening to Dan Sullivan, one of my favorite authors and coaches, he made the observation without going any further that both of these words have exactly the same letters. And I was talking with one of my friends, Pastor Ed Archer, and when we were talking about these two words, he noticed and said, it's all about how you see, right? You move the C to the front, you get creative. You leave the C in the middle, you get reactive. So it's all about how you see. Now, this isn't just a little cute observation. I want to take us a little bit deeper here because this is the whole point of that. We all know that when we react, and again, there's always going to be stressors in our lives, but one of the marks of leaders, of people that are able to navigate challenges, is that we stay in reactive mode for as little time as possible and shift into creative mode. Because when we're in reactive mode, what are we really responding with? We're responding out of fear. It's always true. It's some kind of stress response that fires off our brain, drives energy to certain places, causes us to react in ways that sometimes aren't ultimately in our best interest and aren't ultimately good for most people. Or at worst, we even bury all of that stress inside of us so it leaks out in other parts of our lives. So how can we move from a fear response to being able to show up and be creative? Well, to me, I think it put this simple, it's making a movement from fear to love. It's making a movement, because when we're afraid, what are we really doing? When we're reacting, what are we doing? We're actually interpreting something in light of the past, maybe some negative stimulus, that some landmine's gone off, we've been triggered, whatever, it creates a reaction, or we have some response based on what might happen, worst case scenario. And as most people listening to this have probably experienced, I don't think I'm the only one, most of us have suffered 1,000 deaths or 1,000 disasters that never actually happened except in our imagination. But that's what reaction does. That's what fear does. So how can we pull ourselves out of that fear response? Because it's helpful for a second because it gets our attention, right? But instead of reacting, we want to learn to respond with creativity that comes out of a deep love. And the key for that, and it doesn't matter what your profession is or your vocation, this works in relationships, it works in the job, it works in ministry settings, is we need to create a set of practices, and this is usually even in advance, that pull us back into the present. Because when we're in the present, when we pull ourselves out of that scared part of our brain and bring it back up to the part like this part up here where I don't have any hair, when we pull ourselves to the front, we get our mind working. We can be and respond ultimately, not react, out of that person that God created us to be, out of our identity in Christ. And you can do that by establishing a set of contemplative practices. Now, you can do this in silence on your own. Again, I'm an advocate of centering prayer. Also, I think intentional journaling, when you're capturing things that you're grateful for, when you're noticing and writing out, what's really bothering you, you kind of empty out yourself. You're able to come into the present. But even just as powerfully, we can take those practices into the everyday world. And we can take that into the world oftentimes with our breath. Because if you take a deep breath, when we're in reactive fear mode, we usually start breathing really fast. So learn to take a really deep breath. And if you've learned how to do that contemplative prayer, centering prayer, you can do that. Say something like, Lord, help me, or use a prayer word in your mind to bring you back to the present. Again, we're not talking about the ability to eliminate external stresses. Those are always going to be there. But is it possible, and I think it is, to cultivate an inner space of serenity that we can dial in when we find ourselves caught in reactive fear mode? So, what's the difference between reactive and creative? It's all how you see. And learn to see the world out of that contemplative space where things become an opportunity to ultimately bring love into the world. Love for God, love for neighbor. Again, I'd love to hear what you think. If you want to reach out to me, I'd love to hear from you. deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. Thank you very much for the privilege of serving you today.